Welcome, Chairmen, to, I believe this is the 20th, is this the 20th episode?
The big 2-0.
It is.
20th episode.
We're now out of our teens.
We're out of our teens into the 20th episode. And it's been a pleasure as always. And another thing that's been a great pleasure is to have the support of great sponsors such as our friends over at the Guitar Sanctuary today, as we are speaking about different techniques and tips. We may also give some suggestions on gears and material that we might endorse or like to use. And a lot of that you can get from our sponsor at the Guitar Sanctuary, which is also where Brian Omilion is sitting right now. He's in the west wing of the Guitar Sanctuary, his pedalboard building zone. And if you would want to employ somebody who is a professional like Brian Omilion, or you want to buy professional products for your pedalboard like that of Goodwood Audio by way of their interfacer or many of their other accessories, or products from us at Vertex Effects, those are all available at the Guitar Sanctuary, and Brian can put it all together in a neat package with a nice bow on it via his pedalboard building services. So shout out to the Guitar Sanctuary for sponsoring the podcast. And today we have a really important podcast that I think is one of those things that we hope we never have to do, but invariably always have to do with every pedalboard. It's troubleshooting. And to lead us in this conversation today, I can't think of anybody better than our friend Grant. But before we do that, we want to make another announcement about a new giveaway that we have going on. Ooh. And as you may notice, we have launched our last few episodes on a new channel, which we developed on YouTube, which is strictly for Chairmen of the Boards podcast. It's not through Vertex or any of our individual brands. And so if you decide that you want to subscribe to that channel and you want to leave us a review on iTunes, you will be automatically eligible to win the grand prize of a free Vertex pedalboard of your choosing, any size, any riser size, any pedal platform size, a free Goodwood Audio interfacer of high quality buffers, because there's multiples in those, and isolation.
Yep.
And you get 20 custom made patch cables from Brian that are using Mogami cable and Creation mini cakes. Going to be an absolute amazing, almost $1,000 value just in materials right there to get you jump started on the pro rig of your dreams. And we're going to provide it to you exactly in the size that you want it, whether it's your pedal board, whether it's your custom cables, and a beautiful interfacer to tie it all together with those beautiful buffers on the input and output. And all you need to do is, again, subscribe to our new channel, Chairman of the Boards, on YouTube, and write us a review on iTunes. That will all be linked in the description of the show notes. And if you're watching this on YouTube, you'll see it also in the description. So without further delay, let's get into troubleshooting. Grant, lead us off.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. Firstly, really excited to be back for another week. I love doing the podcast with you guys. This is just a little appreciation moment here. Love doing the podcast with you guys. It's a lot of fun. I thought by now, 20 episodes in, it's like, what more can we talk about pedal boards? But there's always more and more to chat about. And here we are today for troubleshooting. This is an area I feel pretty confident in. I don't want to go overly confident, but I'm pretty confident just because of the fact that I feel like I've made a lot of mistakes. And so I've had a lot of opportunity over the years to, get to troubleshoot a pedal board. And in thinking about this episode, this record that we're doing today, I was thinking back to a time, I'm sure you guys have not experienced this because you're much better at your jobs than I am. Maybe someone listening, just maybe someone has had this same experience, but you are at the beginning of a gig. Sound check has gone beautifully. You go up on stage to start the show, the service, whatever it is you're playing at. You do that quick, that little chink chink to make sure that you got audio coming through your ears, and nothing happens. Why is it that in between sound check and the gig, something goes on with your pedal board? It's just Newton's laws. That's not Newton's laws at all, but that's what we're going to go with today. Newton's law, I think it was his seventh law, states that if your pedal board can fail between sound check and the gig, it invariably will. And so you're in this situation. It's super stressful. and you have about 20 seconds to figure out what's going on before the first song starts. And so what do you do? And so the whole point of this episode in my mind, and would love your guys' insight, is what is the most efficient way to go from I have no sound on my pedal board, I have very little time to figure out where the issue lies, and where do I begin? And so that's kind of in my mind where I would love to take the episode today. So I have a few scenarios I'll probably go through a bit later, and maybe a bit of a troubleshooting toolkit we could touch on as well. Mm-hmm. But let's say you're in that scenario. What is the first thing that goes through your mind? The first thing you check, 20 seconds. What are kind of your quick ticks that you kind of go through in your mind to get your board back up and running? Brian, do you want to kind of start us off? Firstly, have you ever been in that scenario? And secondly, what did you do? What are the ticks or check marks you go through in your head?
Absolutely. Yeah, no. So I've done it multiple times. Because sometimes it's funny, and it's always the very most minimal thing, at least for my rig. Is because I use two different guitars between a hollow body White Falcon or a dual jet. Is sometimes I'll have an A/B switch on there, so I'll pick up the dual jet and I'll go to be ready to play song one, and I got nothing, and I'm like, oh crap. So first I check the cable, make sure the cable's plugged in, and make sure it's in the board plugged in. If I'm getting zero tuning, first off, 20 seconds, I don't have a lot of time, and then I realize, oh shoot, I have an A/B switcher on, and I'll click the switch. That has solved it before in the past. If I am not feeling fancy and I'm only running one guitar for that set, I always, same thing. It's checking, make sure I'm plugged in, because sometimes I just I have the cable over the strap, but it's just dangling. So plug it in, run it into the board. If it's plugged into the board and my tuner's getting signal, it's a matter of actually I would go reverse to where my Dream and my Canvas which are off the board, and I'll make sure XLRs, make sure everything's plugged in, and follow it backwards and make sure my cables didn't get unplugged from my insert cable. There's only a few points in my signal chain that are I check all the major ones. If you're running a switcher, I have the Gig Rig QMX on my board right now, I don't check all the individual overdrives. I don't check the pogs. If you're in a switcher, you don't have to worry about checking that physical pedal. You want to check you could quickly check the input or the output of the switcher if it's accessible. Volume pedal, because that's typically in an insert or after a switcher. So there's always key points where if you know your rig, if it's pedal to pedal, you gotta check them all as quick as possible. So I always check my guitar, go to the board. If all that's plugged in, then I start from the back and work my way to the front. So in a nutshell, that's what I do.
Nice. What about yourself, Mason?
Well, 20 seconds, not really much you can do. I mean, if there actually is a problem and it just isn't a matter of you didn't switch over your A/B switcher, or I had a situation recently where I was working on somebody's rig and they had a polytune that was left always in the on position. And so, but it, and so I couldn't, it was hard to tell whether the tuner was on or off, and whether I wasn't getting signal because it was muted or because the display was on and there was something else down the chain that was not working. But usually with troubleshooting, my approach is always to, if it's something where all of a sudden it stops working, usually that's an intermittent contact of some kind. So jostling around the board, as you've seen people probably do out of frustration, can sometimes at least reorient the contact in such a way where now it's passing signal again in a temporary basis, but it's not a long-term fix. But there's a lot of different strategies. I think if we're restricting it to 20-second strategies, I would say, going through and kind of wiggling around any interconnections of the pedal board, just making sure that all the power supply plugs are still plugged into the pedals, that all of the connectors are fully pushed into all of the pedals, and that, you know, you don't have any like obvious like broken jacks or something like that. I know sometimes people who use like interfaces and stuff like that on stages, those can sometimes get damaged, or, you know, cables can get bent. As long as you don't see anything obvious there, that's kind of the best you can expect to do in a 20-second check of that. And then if it doesn't work, then obviously you're taking your input cable and you're going straight into your amp. If that's sort of the parameter. If we want to get into you know, deeper troubleshooting, I'll go into that when we get to that part. Totally. But I would say if 20 seconds is the parameter, I'd say you're doing a quick spot check of connections, jostling a few things around and hoping that something comes back to life due to an intermittent connection, because that would be the reason that it would come back typically, is that you have some corrosion, you have some oxidation, you know, jack is making contact intermittently, you move it around and it kind of reshuffles it so you're getting enough of a connection again where it now passes the signal.
Or maybe you're using solderless cables. I mean, that could be.
Or maybe
you're
using,
if
you're using solderless cables, man. Yeah, just do the sign of the cross before every gig.
Just plug into the amp directly. Just give up.
Yeah, just do it. Yeah.
I think in my mind, again, looking back on the many times this has happened to me, is you can kind of break it down. If you have limited time, you can break it down. And Brian, you alluded to this perfectly. Guitar, pedalboard, amp. If you plug in your guitar to your pedalboard, and let's say your tuner is early in your chain and your tuner is working, you know that from before that tuner's input backwards up into your guitar, signal is working. If you unplug any output cable, so it's plugged into the output of your tuner, the output of your delay, the output of your chorus pedal, and you touch it with your finger, and you can hear that your amp is getting signal, from that point onwards to your amp, you know that your pedalboard, at least in worst case, intermittently is working. You know that your amp is hearing that signal. So there is a way, if you needed to quickly dial it down to guitar, pedalboard, amp, you can do that in about 5 seconds. You can check your tuner, now your guitar is working. You can unplug your last cable going to your amp and touch it, you know your amp is working. And then from there, you know now somewhere between your tuner and that last cable on your pedalboard, there is an issue. I would say, again, this is personal experience, 9 times out of 10, it's user error. I remember doing a sound check once, and the sound guys were like, I had checked everything on my rig. Luckily, it wasn't right before the service. I checked everything on my rig. It was all working. It was sounding great. I'm like, I am at Tone Town today. And then I go in, I strum my guitar, and I got nothing. I did 5 minutes of like trying to find the issue, and my volume pedal was back. It was the most embarrassing thing. I couldn't let anyone know. I just put my volume pedal back on and pretended to jiggle a cable. I was like, I think I got it, guys. I think we're good. And it was just user error. So a lot of times it's like, what is the simplest thing that I might forget in the heat of the moment? And chances are that's it. But yes, you are right. Sometimes it is a faulty cable or some like physical issue with a pedal. And then in my mind, if you know the amp is working, you know the guitar is working, and you're on a tight turnaround on time, I usually start then by splitting the board in half. I don't usually go pedal to pedal because that takes, like, how can you eliminate the biggest chunk of your pedal board the quickest? So I'll plug into my first wet effect or my first modulation. Do I have signal? Yes. Okay, I know the issue is in the first half of my pedal board in my dry section.
Yeah.
If I don't, then I know it's in the last half in my wet section. Worst case, if I'm out of time, I can at least run my dry section into my amp. Best case, I can narrow it down to something and I can figure out the issue in that really quick amount of time. So I think if you're under pressure, in my mind, the main point I wanted to make here, if you're really under time pressure, understanding signal chain is very closely linked to understanding troubleshooting. If you have a really good general understanding of how signal chain works, both on your specific pedal board and in general, you're going to be much more equipped to be able to troubleshoot your board efficiently. If you don't understand signal chain, and if you're on YouTube, you can see in the back, like Brian has a board in the background right now, which is a medium-sized board. Like it's got a switcher and some Strymons, H9, all that on there. if you get handed this board and you're the owner of that board, but you have no idea what the signal chain is and there's an issue, you're just going to be taking shots in the dark. Like, it's going to be very frustrating. But if you understand your MIDI chain, how the pedals are powered, and then the actual audio signal chain of your pedal board and what pedal comes before what, then you can really quickly turn off all the loops. And then maybe, I'm just making this up, I don't know the signal chain, but you could turn off all the loops, bypass everything, and then all of a sudden you get audio back. Like, okay, now I know the issue is in somewhere in the looper. Maybe a cable got half unplugged and, and I'm losing audio that way. So you could check all your connections.
Or the master volume is down on a pedal. That has happened before.
Not to me, Brian.
Oh, yes,
No,
to
I'm
me.
totally kidding. It definitely happens to me more than I would like to admit.
Especially pedals that have like another pedal that I was working with this last week was the TC Electronic Stereo Chorus pitch modulator flanger, and it has an input gain that's always active.
Yeah.
And I was like, man, this board is so, because when I test a completed board, I always put it in a true bypass looper to compare how close it sounds to just the guitar into the amp. So it'll be like guitar into the input of the true bypass looper, send and return of the true bypass loopers to the pedal board, and then output goes to the amp. So I can like bring in the pedal board with everything in bypass. I was like, God, man, I don't think I've done this bad of a job in a while as far as like the difference between the sound. It's like, it sounds so attenuated, and there's no volume pedal on the board or anything like that. And then I was like looking like like the input gain got like moved like almost all the way down. And so then I had to like kind of like trim it out with the actual bypass sound so I could kind of get them to be even. But there's always stuff like that, little things. But I agree with you on like if you're in a time crunch to sort of separate or partition the board so that it's easy to take chunks of it to sort of vet it out. And sometimes when I'll do that, if I'm troubleshooting something, I'll sometimes look for like obvious spots where it's easy to do that, because sometimes having access to the cable connection can be hard for certain pedal placements. And so I don't use I'm trying to, especially if it's just like a board that I just finished, right? You don't want to completely rip the whole thing apart when you're doing, troubleshooting. So I usually try to look for obvious places where the jacks are maybe more accessible, where I can maybe break into without that much disruption and be able to kind of like retest from that place to see like, okay, if I can get 3/4 of the pedal board working and I can restrict it to 3 pedals that I'm troubleshooting, that's a whole lot easier than troubleshooting every single pedal.
Totally.
I would say, though, also as a separate thing, especially if the troubleshooting is occurring as a result of a new build, I don't know what your guys' approach is to this, but usually I always have like a 30-foot cable with a right angle silent plug on it. And when I'm building the board, every pedal I'll retest in sequence. And if I'm in a switcher, I'll put the cable on the output of the switcher. And as I bring in each loop, or I solder in each loop, I'll test it. Because it's a lot easier if you're in the building process in troubleshooting to do it as you're adding more pedals, so that you're not having to try to figure out where the problem occurred. Because sometimes, even if you build the cables properly, the pedals can sometimes have issues. Especially if you're using, if you're getting into building and you've taken on somebody else's pedals, or you're using a pedal that you haven't used in a while, there can be intermittent issues within the pedals that you're not even aware of. And even if you did everything right, a jack could be corroded. And I would say that this also gets into, we could save this for later. I don't have to talk about it now. But prep to pedals before they go onto a pedal board as sort of good maintenance to avoid troubleshooting down the line. There's a process that I do to pretty much every pedal before it even goes onto a board to ensure that it's in its best possible condition to sort of, last the voyage to the new world of Tonetown.
Love that.
I will say though, there was a time, and disregard this if you are a guitar player or whatever, or anything that uses a live amp, is going direct. A lot of times, the sound guy just has the whole band muted before you go to play, and I did the nothing, and I started freaking out and checking all this stuff, and I got nothing, and I'm like, oh my gosh. And then like 5 seconds before, I find out that he hasn't unmuted anything because he's getting a coffee or something. And
so
you're
saying
just
he has
like,
his priority straight. That's what I'm hearing.
so like I'm saying, like there's stuff like that you gotta even consider. Like if you're using an AVM monitor or using in-ears or something, and you can check like your mix. If you see no levels, then that means your front of house is obviously not
asleep at
unmuted.
the wheel.
It's asleep at the wheel because church people have super early sound checks. But if you're playing like a gig or something and you're using a tube amp or a live amp or whatever, and you have no signal, then disregard that. I'm just saying that has happened to me where I've done that oh my gosh moment, and he's like, oh yeah, I just haven't unmuted. I don't unmute until 5 seconds before, and I'm like, no, you need to unmute that a lot soon. I need my chit chit. Okay, we're good.
Chit chit. Yep.
So,
Love that. So one more little section on signal chain, and then maybe we could move on to like, let's get rid of the time crunch, and you're at home building a rig, or something's wrong, you need to troubleshoot it. We'll move on to that in a sec. But just to give people an idea of the relation of signal chain, practically speaking, I have come up with some scenarios.
Okay.
These have not happened to me because I only build perfect rigs.
of course,
Okay.
you build good.
How to spot a liar. I never have issues with my pedal board. Okay. You guys can just chime in and answer these. Just the first thing that comes to mind. There's a whole bunch of unknowns, obviously, like how does the person have their pedal board run, all that. We'll just get rid of that. Just assume the most basic. First scenario, you're running a stereo pedal board. Only the left side is getting signal. The right side is not. Where is the issue? Potentially.
Okay.
Or first thoughts that come to mind on
I'm
what
there.
the issue could be.
I'm there.
Mason, take it away.
Well, it's occurring after wherever the stereo split occurs. So if you have, let's say, your last pedal before the stereo split is a boost, let's say, and let's say it's a Vertex boost, and then it goes into a stereo chorus.
Yep.
You said only the left channel works?
Correct.
Yeah, so then you would just be looking at the cable interconnections on the right side of the stereo split. So you'd be looking, first just to ensure, like, let's say you have an interface of some kind, you'd want to walk it back to the last pedal, and instead of going out of the interface on the right, you just go directly out of the pedal. Make sure that that's either telling you that there's an issue with the interface output, or the cable that's connecting from the pedal to the interface is problematic. If you're getting signal at that point, then you could have I always have spare patch cables sitting around for this exact reason. You could plug in a spare patch cable into the interface, then move the cable back to the output of the interface. If that's working, then it just tells you that one cable that connects the last pedal, the interface, is problematic. If it still doesn't work, then it probably is indicative that the interface is not working. But I usually start at the end and then just work back toward the problem. And usually with stereo pedals, for the wet signal path, most pedal boards maybe only have a couple of pedals, so it shouldn't be too many cables to have to troubleshoot. And you would only have to focus on the right side if the left side is already working.
Perfect. So we know the dry section is working. We know the left side is good. So we can narrow it down super quickly before we even unplug anything.
Yeah.
Okay, next one. You have a wet dry. Oh, Brian,
can I add into it? I just want to add two things. One, does your interface box have some kind of summing added to it, to where, because I've seen some summing boxes where it'll sum it only to the left side, will do dual mono. So check that. And also, if you're running stereo amps, is one of them still on standby?
Oh, nice.
Not
I like that,
saying
Ryan.
It's happened to me, but it has happened to me.
It's happened to a guy I know.
I was hired to play at a church. I was contracted for a couple of weeks during COVID, and they were beautiful deluxe AC30, like the heavy deluxe AC30s, not the Tone Masters where they're super light, and a Vox AC30 into aux boxes. They were beautiful. I loved them and everything. And then we hit the first song, and I was like, why is it only my left side? And I was like, oh my gosh, I put it on standby. And I realized I flicked.
Where's my
I turned
roadie?
one off. I was just like, what is going on? And luckily they were right behind me because into auxes, no stage volume. So I just turned around and flick, and then I had full volume. So yeah, if you're running amps, and a lot of venues or churches, wherever you're playing, either like your amp is right behind you, like at a venue, you can clearly tell if it's working or not. And some churches have where they have the amps or the heads on the stage, and then they're running back to an ISO booth. If the church is running live cabinets, and awesome, but practically they're running into aux boxes or cabinets in a different room. But just make sure you check those standby switches, because I always put my stuff on standby. But yeah, I just wanted to add to that.
But
That's
Brian Omilion would have never done that.
No, never. Ever. No.
That was Orion Bromillion.
Yeah, that's exactly
Orion.
it.
Yeah.
In another parallel universe.
Yeah, he has 2 L's in his name.
Yeah.
I only have 1.
Exactly.
He can afford that second L.
That's a long walk of shame, by the way. I don't know if you guys have ever had to do that. I've gotten my steps in, my 10,000 steps, doing the walk from stage all the way back to the ISO room. Flip the standby, come back. And I forgot the other amp all the way back. Yeah, it's good. Getting the exercise. Next one, you have a wet rig. You're only running inputs, so you're running to the input of a dry amp, the input of a left and a right amp. Your dry amp is working. Your wet amps are not. What's the first thing that comes to mind? Standbys are all on.
The splitter. You have to take it from the splitter.
All right. So we know we're getting signal up until the dry output, but then somewhere between the send to the first wet effect and onwards, there's an issue.
Yeah, because if it's all inputs, right, then you have to use some sort of splitter to get from the dry amp to the wet amps with the processing stuff. So I think it's kind of the same exact situation that I would think of in a stereo rig, except now instead of just troubleshooting the left channel, you're doing left and right. But it's likely if both channels weren't working, it's happening before it even gets to the stereo path, because the probability of both there being a cable failure on left and right sides of the effects of the stereo effects is unlikely, unless you had like a bad run of plugs, which we've talked about it has happened, where a manufacturer will have a batch of bad plugs and there'll be multiples that won't work, and that is possible, but it's very unlikely, and it's probably more likely something that is feeding the stereo effects before it becomes stereo, if both channels are not working. I will say
this has happened to me. This one actually has happened to me when I ran after our wet dry wet podcast. I was like, I gotta go try it, and I did, and I loved it. But then my back hurt because the board was gigantic and everything. But I will say I was using your guys' Audition to do the send to the front amp and the return, and then I was doing an interfacer. And I found that I had the master mute on at the interfacer. So the wets weren't being sent, only the dry. And in the heat of the moment, I just didn't. I saw that beautiful LED was on, and I didn't think anything of it because my whole board has LEDs all over it. So whatever. And then I was like, screw it. I'll just play with the dry stuff. And then I was like, wait, that's muted. I clicked it off and I had it all back. So that's another one I would say check, is if you have some kind of interface box that has a master mute on it, make sure it's not muted.
Love it. Okay, I'll do 2 more quick ones and then we'll move on. You hit your board. Let's say you turn on an overdrive.
And not like physically assaulting the board.
No, you love your board, man. You treat that thing with care. You turn on an overdrive and your whole board power starts flickering on and off.
IEC cable. That's the first one I would check.
That'd be the first point of...
Yeah, I mean, because power units... Why do all of these refer to me? Because I've done every single one of these. I literally have done all of these. It's ridiculous. On some power units, like the IEC, if IEC is the 3-prong connector, I don't know if there's a better term for it, but like that casing that's with the power supply don't have one handy. Otherwise, I'd show. Sometimes it can wiggle out. They're not the tightest. I think when you get into like the chocks, like the 2-prong, those connectors are really nice and tight going in, like for the main power. Some connectors do it. I've just noticed like the 3-prong end that goes into your unit sometimes can just get loose. It can wiggle. It's less likely that the side that's going into like the outlet of the wall or the power strip that you're running is gonna come unplugged, because those are a lot tighter of a connection. But I always check the power unit. If it's flickering, if the whole board is flickering, it's checking the IEC. If it is a single pedal, I either give it the good kick, it might come back on. I did that with my Big Sky 2 weeks ago, actually. And I found out that my DC cable was just hanging on there. So it kind of depends. If the whole board's flickering, check the AC, the IEC inputs. If it's a single pedal, it's likely one of those outlets.
Anything to add, Mason?
Yeah, I think if it's whole board, it's something related to the power supply, and it doesn't necessarily have to be the IEC, the electrotechnical. Was it what we looked it up? The International Electrotechnical Commission.
Yeah,
is that right?
Yeah.
And if anybody wants to sponsor us on that commission, we'll accept. But I would either say it's related to the power supply. It could be the IEC, but I've seen issues where I've seen issues in a specific supply that we've mentioned is a very good supply, but is underbuilt mechanically. And I've seen situations where some of the nuts and washers that secure the IEC to the chassis will come loose, and they will start rattling around inside of the power supply. And I've had one do a short because of however the nut was touching two components together in a way that was unsatisfactory. And if you could, that you kind of jostle it around and then it would come back to life all of a sudden. So there can be problems like that in power supplies, I'd say, however rare, but it could be the IEC, it could be something internal to the power supply. If it's an individual pedal that's flickering on and off, it's probably related to the power cable, or that the pedal itself, the jack could be dirty or needed to be cleaned with contact cleaner. That goes back to one thing I was kind of talking about earlier about pedal prep, which we can get into. About how to prepare a pedal to be on a pedal board to last a while and not have to troubleshoot it. But I would say it would be one of those things typically.
Cool. All right, last one really quick. You have your MIDI chain. So you have your audio signal chain and you have your MIDI chain. Yep. You got 3 pedals run in series in your MIDI chain. So one into the other, into the other, into the other. Mm-hmm. Your first pedal is getting MIDI changes. Your last 2 are not. What's the first thing that comes to mind?
Check the MIDI through.
Yeah, absolutely.
So make sure the MIDI through on the first pedal is turned on so that it's passing MIDI signals on to the last 2 in the chain.
Yeah, I mean, if it was working prior, the cable, make sure it didn't come out, because you'll get some MIDI cables that are not as tight of a connection, like these. MIDI cables with like these type of connectors, I think we all use them.
The right angles.
Yeah, the Switchcraft.
Switchcraft.
Yeah. Very hard
wrote down
part
the
number.
name. I just posted
DLMX 2713.
Yeah.
Whatever it is.
I put
That's the tattoo that you need to get, Brian.
It really does. It just needs to be like.
When you're calling your suppliers, like, yeah, I need another
this one. Yeah, I posted a reel this morning and everyone was like, "What is that MIDI cable?" And I had to find the name because I just call it the Switchcraft plug. I can never remember the number.
Yeah,
but like
I think they're technically called clocking MIDI connectors because they can move in the positions of the clock.
Which is really handy. I even wrote it down. It was, I can't remember. I put it somewhere. It was 05DL5M. That's the official part number. But these type of I didn't know that until like an hour ago. These type of connectors are really nice and like will fit nice and snug inside MIDI connector, whatever they're called, the house. But some of them will not. So it might have just popped out or whatever, and or you plugged the cable into the output instead of the inputs if you're just putting your board together. So there's a couple of different things you can check. But if like your rig worked at home and you go to the gig and it stops working because that MIDI cable is not sending to the third device, check to make sure the cable's plugged in. Or I always like to have spare MIDI cables because there's so many little wires inside of here and so many pins that need to be working together. It's always nice to have a backup. I mean,
nice. Which actually is a great segue. Thank you, Brian. Into my next kind of question, and this I think might tie in a bit, Mason, into what you're thinking about prepping and, you know, trying to prevent issues from happening. But let's tie it all in together. If you guys were going to a gig, let's say quite an important one, so you wanted to have backups, you wanted to be ready for any scenario, what are you going to bring as your kind of troubleshooting toolkit, or what do you have at home in your troubleshooting toolkit, and how do you kind of make sure pedals are not going to fail, things are not going to happen ahead of time? So kind of a two-part question, but Mason, I mean, you've already got some insights here. So what would you say, firstly, in your toolkit, and secondly, top tips for preventing issues from happening in the first place?
Yeah, troubleshooting toolkit, I always have a couple of patch cables in various lengths, you know, so maybe as long as 3 feet and as short as maybe, 6 inches. I would say if you were trying to limit the number of troubleshooting patch cables that you have, probably erring on the side of longer is better, because it's impermanent, even if you do need to actually utilize one of these for a gig, and it's better that you have more length than less length to be able to accommodate, different stretches of connections between pedals. So I'd say having a few of those. I'd say having a spare instrument cable, preferably, again, erring on the side of being longer. So whatever the longest instrument cable is that you need for your rig to connect to, I'd say having at least one backup is a good thing to have, just in case, even things out of your control. If somebody steps on one of your instrument cables and damages it to the point where it can't be used, and you want to make sure that you are having the most direct route to Tone Town. You don't want to use, whatever, the live wire that your church has has bought in bulk at Guitar Center.
30 years ago.
So whatever terrible brand it might be. So in any case, I usually have some of those. I always have Deoxit, which is a contact cleaner. D5 needs to be something that every guitar player needs to have in their, with them on their person at all times.
Whether you're playing a gig or not, just have Deoxit
on your belt. Just get a belt clip.
Yeah, on your person, Deoxit D5. And I know I've been asked this question: can I just get this other brand that I found, at some obscure place that's less expensive? And the answer is no. Deoxit is unique in that not only does it clean your contacts, but it also protects them from future dirt and corrosion. And there are some contact cleaners out there that are actually not very effective in what they do and can actually have an adverse effect over time. Contact cleaner is one of those things too, where for the most part, as long as you're not just completely drenching your pedal, you can be pretty liberal with it. And the important thing is when you spray it, you need to work it through, and it may look suggestive, and we can save maybe some of these techniques for our OnlyFans. But when you have to unplug the jack multiple times to work in the contact cleaner, and so we'll have that later on for those of you who want to do the Chairman of the Boards after dark. You can join us on OnlyFans for that, and there'll be plenty of contact cleaner to go around. And so I would say, you really want to work it in, because some people I see just spray it and they don't do anything with it afterwards, and so it prevents it from actually fully coating and covering whatever the contact is that you're trying to clean. So this would be used for input and output jacks, as well as the power jack. Those things all need to be cleaned and they'll be totally fine. So I would say those are toolkit essentials. And I can come back to the preparation part if you want, so that Brian has a chance to weigh in on his sort of essentials.
Anything you'd add, Brian?
Yeah. So I have to say this because it seems like the most common comment that I get from videos or photos or anything will people be like, oh, that's too many zip ties that you're going to have to clip if a bad cable goes out.
Yes.
And if you think about it,
Perverts.
So this is the thing. Think about it this way. You're stepping on this stuff. Stuff can break. Stuff, like, it doesn't matter if it was made by two Norwegian whatever people that use
Monks.
gold. It doesn't freaking matter
Yes.
what it is. Like, I'm saying, like, I don't know. I had a Michael Scott moment. I didn't know where I was going. I was just
Those
Thanks to all our
gold
Norwegian
Norwegians.
listeners.
I don't know where I was
They're
going.
the best kind.
We're the 760th best podcast in Norway, just FYI.
Oh, perfect. But it doesn't matter if they're wrapping them in gold and like they're saying these are the best things. Things will fail. So one thing I will say is, like, I agree. I also have extra cables, couple extra instrument cables, sometimes a couple extra MIDI cables. But the thing is if any of that kind of stuff needs to be swapped out, don't rip apart your whole board at your gig or start trying to snip zip ties. Just jerry rig that sucker, make it just look as janky as possible, but make it work. So someone's like, oh, I would hate to have to clip 50 zip ties for that one gig. I'm like, don't do that. You got to fix that at the connector when you get home in an hour, when you're sitting down watching Friends and you're playing and your pedal board's right there. Like, sit down and fix the cable. But if you're at your gig, just add that 3-foot cable that you have in your bag, click it in, and you're good to go. So I'm always a couple extra patch, MIDI, sometimes power cables, because sometimes power cables go bad. It just happens to be a thing. I had one IEC cable die on me, which was the weirdest thing. I don't know why.
That's never happened to me.
It's the weirdest thing, and I don't know why. And I switched out and it worked just fine. But yeah, I would say those are my suggestions. And never think that your board is 110% indestructible because you're stomping on it. And some people stomp on pedals. I'm just like broken foot switches. Like, there's just a lot, and obviously that kind of stuff you can't fix on the spot. So
Got a jerry rig, and as you said, now is Jerry is he Norwegian?
No, he's Polish.
Okay, because I was gonna say it's not a very Norwegian name. We need like a Bjorn or
Mr. Rig. Mr. Rig is much more of a Polish name.
Does Mr. Rig have like really long, like real long hair? Because Mr. Clean has a bald head. Would Mr. Rig? Would he just have like a man bun? Or
he's quite.
I think I could do it. I could do this.
Yes.
Yep. Are you Mr. Rig?
Are you Mr.
Jerry
Mr.
Rig?
Mr. Jerry Dr. Rig.
The only thing I would say I would add to that list is, and depending on who you are, I've seen a lot of guys bring a spare tuner and a battery. So worst case.
That's a good one.
You got a tuner with a battery. You can still tune and go to your amp. If something were to happen, obviously the list could keep growing, and then you need to bring your own Pelican for backup scenarios, and that's impractical. So,
Well, it does remind me of one thing though that actually is really helpful. So one thing, I haven't done this in a long time, but when I had it, I loved having it. Where I adapted. Like when you get a power supply from a lot of different companies, a lot of them will have that battery adapter clip where you can snap onto the battery clip internally and then be able to run that to your power supply for like a vintage fuzz or something like that doesn't already have a DC connector. Yeah. You can change those, you can modify those to be used where the battery's on the outside instead of clipping the clip in the inside. And that can be a really helpful tool if you're having a power supply related issue. I have had an issue with a board once where one of the outputs just died for whatever reason. And it was disruptive to the signal chain, and having just a standalone battery that was in a battery clip that had a 2.1 millimeter barrel connector on the end instead of a pigtail to connect it to another another cable. You could just plug it right into the back of the pedal, and it could be its own sort of isolated power supply. And just FYI, batteries are the original isolated power supply. It's the quietest possible option that you could have. And I always use them too for testing if a pedal is noisy on a power supply. If you go to a battery, it will tell you whether the power supply is the problem or if the pedal's the problem, because you put it on a battery, it's going to be the quietest that it can possibly be, assuming that the pedal is able to accept a battery. You couldn't do that to a Strymon or something like that, but to most overdrive and distortion and kind of analog pedals, you should be able to run a battery at least for a short period of time.
Love it. Yeah. Well, time wise, I mean, we're getting kind of close to the end, but I know let's briefly cover the preventative maintenance things you would do to make sure that we don't. Things you would do to make sure you don't have to listen to this podcast in the first place. Yeah. Maybe we should have started with this and just ended. I don't know. But what would you guys do? What are your top tips for preventing issues from happening in the first place?
I would say it's always investing in high quality stuff, high quality cables. If it's getting cables made by Grant at Goodwood, or anything, don't go and buy these pack of 5 cables were they were $10 for 15 cables. These are gonna be great.
I charge that for one.
Right. So, and a lot of people get deterred by it's $30 like MIDI cables. It's $30 for that MIDI cable. It's like, well, the connectors alone are like
$20.
$20. Yeah. So
is Norwegian gold really worth it? The answer is yes.
Is it? Always. It's always worth it. Always. So investing, if you're going to go spend $400 or $500 on a pedal, make sure you spend good money on good cabling. That I will say, things still can break. That's the thing. Nothing is indestructible. But a lot of it can be prevented by having good quality stuff to get you along the way. And this has happened to me, someone will be singing. I don't know why I did this. Someone will be singing on the front row, and someone actually stepped back on my board and broke the right angle. It was the worst, and they felt so bad, and I felt bad that they felt bad, and it was an easy swap up. But they literally stood.
But you took it out of their hide, and that's what counts.
Here's my bank details. Make sure you transfer right away.
Send Venmo me right now. I just walked in with my barcode for Venmo, but no, they stepped on my pancake cable and it broke, and in that kind of instance, people can be like, oh, these are soldered cables. Yeah, but someone just stood on it and broke it and snapped it. So, investing in high quality stuff, making sure it's secured or tucked away, and kind of hidden under pedals or channels, whatever you got to do to just make it solid and bulletproof. And then always do the once in a while checkup. Use the tone brush, clean off your pedals. Take care of your board. It's like washing your car or changing the brakes on your car. You got to do maintenance on your board and make sure it stays clean, because there's plenty of guys that do outside gigs, or girls, anyone, they do outside gigs, and it gets dirty, and that dust can get in.
I got a pedalboard back from Burning Man once. That was pretty cool.
Yeah, I want to hear. I want to hear that. I'm just saying, things get really dirty from dust, and that stuff can get inside the jacks or in the pots, and it can cause issues. I literally did one of those wipes on one pedal, and you could see the thing from my wipe mark, the mark of just how dirty it was. And he's like, yeah, it's causing me all these issues. And once I cleaned it off and everything, he's like, wow, it's amazing what you do. I'm like, I cleaned it. So it's just maintaining your board and maintaining your equipment. You do it for your guitar, so might as well do it for your board.
I'm just
That's what
envisioning like cut to a shot of Brian in the back of the guitar sanctuary with the pressure washer just going over the whole board.
I'm just sitting there like
that. Actually, you brought up one thing that it drives me crazy when people do this, because I just see the next broken pedal or cable is when their board is so tight that they've had to hang a pedal over the edge of the board and the jack is beyond the side of the pedal board. And it's like, what's the first thing that is going to break on this board? Because every time you put it in its case or every time something gets knocked, that is the one point that is going to take the impact. And I would just say, practical tip, make sure that the edge of the pedal board is the edge of the pedal board. Like that's the furthest thing out, so that when your pedal board does get hit or someone does back into it, they step or kick the frame of the board and not an exposed jack or even worse, a power jack or a power cable, which is more fragile.
Yeah.
Mason, what do you think? Preventative maintenance tips.
I think, like I said, the Deoxit D5, they have different concentrations, but I think for most of us, the D5 aerosol can is our friend.
Can you tell people how they'd use it? Like, when do you even know you need Deoxit? We haven't gone there yet.
So I would say just in general, you need to be using it before you put it together any board. And when I start with any board, whether it's mine or somebody else's, the first thing that I do is I qualify every pedal. I test every pedal to make sure that it is working and functioning properly. Because one of the consequences of being somebody who builds rigs, although I don't do it professionally on the level that Brian and Grant do it, because I very occasionally will make a rig. When I was doing it with regularity, people will hold you accountable for any failure, whether it has anything to do with your workmanship or not. If a pedal fails and somebody is incapable of troubleshooting it, they're going to say, my rig doesn't work, take care of it, even though it could be related to the one of their pedals that has nothing to do with the pedal board. It's almost like you absorb the responsibility for everything that's on the board, even though you were only responsible for the assembly and the interconnections of everything that's on it.
Yeah.
So in order to mitigate that, even though that's, obviously not fair, I test all the pedals individually. I make sure that all the jacks are properly seated and tightened, that all of the potentiometers are properly tightened. And that requires that you remove the bottom from a lot of the pedals, because especially for the stuff that's not on a PC board, you can't just start tightening it. Otherwise, it could just be spinning inside and you could break a wire or something like that. So I always take apart the pedal. I contact clean all the jacks, work in the contact cleaner, you tighten all the jacks, tighten all the pots, make sure all the knobs are tightened, clean the pedals off, tone brush them. If the dirt is kind of more loose, if it's kind of more caked on there, you might need to use some Clorox wipes or something like that to kind of get it there, or some alcohol. You just want to be careful that you're not damaging any of the powder coating. I've talked about this before in some of our videos. I'm not sure if I've talked about it here, but a lot of the pedals also leave the bottom case floating. Because they don't remove the paint from the countersink holes. Let's say on like a standard Hammond 1590 box, like I don't have one handy, so I can't show you. But there's little countersunk holes in the four corners, and if they have paint in there and the screw is not making direct contact with an unpainted area or a masked area, it's just as though the bottom is off the enclosure for the purposes of shielding. So a lot of pedal companies are actually not getting the benefit of a full shield on both sides of the pedal. So usually, and I'd say this is true of probably 80 or 90% of pedal companies, I'll take a Dremel tool and I'll just get the paint removed in the countersinks, so that when the case goes together, you're getting the benefit of the full shield of the case. So I'll do that to it as well. That's not really a maintenance thing so much, or like a troubleshooting thing, but it's just a good way to make sure that the pedal is as quiet as it could possibly be, because you're actually fully shielding what's there. So I'll test it, contact clean it, tighten all the jacks, ensure that everything's working. I'll test it again after I tighten it, just to make sure that, like, I don't know, like a wire didn't get, moved around or jostled or something's not working. Make sure that that's all good. And then I know that the pedal is ready now to be implanted onto the board. The other thing that I talked about doing earlier is as I add each pedal to the board and I'm adding audio cables to it, I test it as I add each pedal. So I'm never too far away from the starting point where I've already validated all of the equipment. When I run into a problem, I know that it's isolated to the thing that I just added. It's not whatever 5 things down. Or if it were, it would be very unusual if you've already vetted it. So it just cuts down your troubleshooting time where you're maybe investing a little bit more upfront in terms of the time. But at the end, you're not having to go like, oh crap, I need to now pull apart 3/4 of this pedal board because I don't know where the problem is. So those are just things that I would say about the troubleshooting aspect in sort of being preventative about kind of approaching the pedal board build.
Love it. Yeah, I think that's the main areas I wanted to cover. I'll just say one more time that I think if you have a pedal board and you're responsible for the audio coming out of it, which I would say you always are, understand your signal chain, how the pedals are connected together. The bigger the board, the more work that is going to be. If you're a touring musician, having it written down for a tech or for someone else that might help you is absolutely a must. The more you understand your signal chain and how things flow in and affect the next thing in the chain, the more efficiently you're going to be able to troubleshoot a rig if and when something does happen. I suspect just about every guitar player, musician listening to this has been in that stressful situation, and you know the feeling of being in a gig with your gear not working properly. So it does really pay off to put in just a bit of time to understand the rig, and if something happens, what am I going to do to fix it? And having those tools there at a gig to be able to do it quickly. But yeah, I think troubleshooting is an underrated skill, and I think it is one that you'll be very grateful for the time and understanding you put into it. It will pay itself off. And honestly, it can be the difference at a gig between using effects or not. If you understand troubleshooting. Absolutely. So any last things you guys would say before Mason, you close us out?
Take care of your stuff. I'm all about just preventative maintenance, that kind of stuff. Care about your investment, that kind of stuff. And have fun. Don't make being a musician and having to work on your stuff, like, don't make it like it's like such a chore that you hate doing it. It's fun to pull the board apart and clean it and do your little checkups and stuff. So, I just say, if you want your stuff to last, make sure you do that maintenance. So that's what I say, and invest in good quality components.
Love it. Any last thoughts, Mason?
No, just I'm in agreement with Brian. I think I always say once a quarter, just get in there with the tone brush. If you don't know what that is, it's just a paintbrush. And you could go acrylic. You could go horsehair.
Yep.
There's many different varieties. I have a few different types of tone brushes. Some that are more narrow for tighter spaces, and some that are broad brushes that I can kind of use as just a quick once over. I'd say contact clean all of your jacks probably once a quarter is just a good practice, just to make sure everything is working properly, and make sure that you again work in that contact cleaner with the provided jack. And you really can't use too much. I mean, I wouldn't go crazy, but give it a good spray, and all of your input and output jacks, all your 9-volt DC jacks, work in the contact cleaner, do it once a quarter. That'll just ensure that you're not going to have any issues due to intermittent contacts. Don't use solderless cables, use high quality materials. And that's, again, like Brian and Grant said, you can't completely eliminate a problem, but you can stack the deck in your favor as much as possible. And by using good materials, by using high quality stuff, by keeping it clean, it's just reducing the probability of an unexpected problem that can't be mitigated in the moment. So, the more effort and steps you take to do that, the less probability you're going to have of a problem.
It's kind of like bringing a spare tire in your trunk on the way to Tone Town.
Yeah.
You
Yep.
wanna be ready for anything, you know?
And
Do I
make sure
bring the
yeah.
6-pack of donuts, or do I chuck those out and do I put the spare tire in the back? I
Yep.
know what one I'm choosing every time.
Can I get a witness?
Donuts.
You have one
What?
here.
Yeah.
Do you want to close this out, Mason?
Yeah. So I think that was actually really helpful, and I think if anybody who is listening to this, I know it can be daunting because usually when you're troubleshooting, you're not in your best frame of mind, and so hopefully
Very
this
true.
gives you a little bit of solace, and you can take this to your next troubleshooting endeavor, and may it be swift and easy to resolve, hopefully as a consequence of listening to this podcast. I just want to remind people again that we are going to be starting a giveaway starting on the 22nd of August. It's going to be running the entire month. The giveaway is going to include a free interfacer from Goodwood Audio, a free pedal board from us at Vertex, any size, any riser, any pedal board surface you want. And Brian is going to be making 20 custom-made patch cables for using Mogami cable and Creation plugs. The way that you can enter to win these items, and they're all going to get to go to one person, is that you're going to, one, sign up for our new channel or become a subscriber of our new channel, Chairmen of the Boards, on YouTube, and we're going to have that linked in the show notes and in the description. And you can write us a review on iTunes, and that's a really helpful way to help other people find this podcast who might be interested in similar things to you: gear, good tone, pedal boards, DIY tips, things like that. So if you do those two things, you can get 2 entry points toward winning this particular giveaway. And if you only want to do one of them, then you would just have 1 point for entry. But if you want to maximize your probability to win, it's like having 2 tickets in the raffle instead of 1. The more you do, the more opportunities you have to win. So that will be going from August 22nd. I'll be going for the entire month. And we have some great items for giveaway. So please do that. And I want to thank again our sponsor of the show, the Guitar Sanctuary, where Brian is housed. We're sitting right now if you're watching this on YouTube, and they also are sellers of great products like our stuff at Vertex Effects and Goodwood audio products. So if you want any of that, you can definitely get it there. And I bet they probably even sell Deoxit D5, which we talked about today. And if not, Brian will just hose you down with D5 in the parking lot. If you want to just take a trip over to the Guitar Sanctuary, he's got it on hand. So thank you to them for sponsoring the podcast, and we really appreciate that. And thank you to you all gentlemen for participating today, episode 20. I had a great time.
Thank you.
Fun.
Same.
See you next week.
All right. See ya.